Hi, my name is Mark Schwartz. I'm an enterprise strategist with AWS. And I'd like to ask you, is your digital transformation moving forward at the pace you'd like? Does it seem to be stuck, perhaps? This happens a lot. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about some strategies and some things I've learned about how to get traction or momentum behind a digital transformation. In one of my books, I proposed something I call the bobblehead effect. This is something that I've been part of myself. It's something that I see a lot. Uh, I imagine a group of executives sitting around a conference room table, and they're talking about how important it is for their company to transform digitally. And they're all in agreement. Everyone's nodding. There's consensus between everybody. They say, yes, the world has been going digital. Yes, customers expect a more seamless experience. Yes, legacy IT approaches are holding the company back. Disruptor companies are eating our lunch. They're all agreeing, and heads are bobbing in agreement. Yet nothing seems to be happening. I see this all the time, and to be honest, I've been part of it myself. I've been one of those heads at the table. So this is all in fun, but what I want to say is that this is a normal thing for large enterprises that are planning large changes, where they know it's important, they know they've got agreement, and yet they don't seem to be moving forward for some reason. So what I'd like to do today is first of all examine the causes for that, what's going on, and try to give you a few tactics that you can use to get things moving when you see that happen. I've learned a few tricks, let's say, in my career. Before I joined AWS, I was the CIO of US Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Department of Homeland Security. Now, if this isn't obvious to you, that's an environment where it's hard to get traction for change sometimes. Nevertheless, we went from a slow waterfall sort of approach to IT delivery, where it took us 18 months in between each release of each of our systems on the average. We went from that to releasing new capabilities, new IT capabilities and changes about 3 times a day, every day. We did this in an environment that was highly resistant to change and where it took a lot of energy and effort to get things done. But we managed to introduce cloud technology, DevOps, all of the other sort of typical tools of the digital age. We did it, not only did we do it, but we did it in a way where we had more control over everything we were doing. We had better financial controls, we had better security, we had better governance, we thought, over everything that we were doing. But to get there, we had to think pretty deeply about what it means to transform and how to do so in an organization that was heavily regulated and very much in the public eye all the time. So I'm going to try to share a few of the things that worked for us today, and I hope they'll work for you as well. So first thing is, why do transformations get stuck? And I've identified a few reasons from what I've seen from talking to other companies and going through it myself. The first thing is perceived risk. Anything that has the name transformation sounds like a big risky project, right? So immediately it brings out fear, it brings out worry on everybody's part, um, and it requires extensive planning, a lot of sign-offs and approvals from different people in the organization. Second is perceived deficiencies in skills and culture. Employees often don't have the skills that you need for the transformed world that you're trying to move into. The organization's culture often resists the change, and a lot of companies have outsourced the important skills that they're going to need in order to pull off a transformation. A third thing is the perceived lack of time and capacity. Now, obviously, everybody in your organization is working, and they're working full time. That's natural, right? So it always seems impossible to add on to what they're currently doing something that's big, a big transformation. And a lot of companies get stuck trying to figure out how they're going to make time in order to be able to do the transformation. A fourth thing that I see is a lack of alignment. And you'll notice I've been talking about perceived problems before, but now I'm talking about a real problem. Um, Often organizations haven't figured out how this transformation actually aligns with their business goals and haven't set it up so that it's directly aimed at accomplishing actual business goals. And then the last thing that I'll mention that I see is it's a little paradoxical. When you're doing a big transformation, everybody in the organization thinks of it as the way to solve all of the problems. So everybody is adding their pet ideas to the transformation. Everybody's expecting that it's going to completely change everything, and so they need to make sure that they get all of their ideas into it. And this results in a lot of planning and a lot of advanced work before things even get started. So those are the five things that I often see associated with lack of traction or a lack of movement in a transformation. And as a result, we see these bubbling heads often around the executive table. We know what we need to do, but it's just hard to get it off the ground. So let's take each of those things in turn and see how we might solve or overcome each of these impediments. First was this perception of risk. So it turns out that when you sit down and examine all the risks of a transformation, you find that in truth, a lot of what you're perceiving as risk is actually more fear. You don't know exactly where the risks are. You think there are probably some risks because you don't fully understand where you're going. But the truth is that the transformation process and the digital world are all about reducing risks, actually. So if you're thinking of your transformation as this big 5-year, humongous project that you're going to do, of course, it's risky in that way. On the other hand, it lends itself very much to incremental delivery and incremental change, short, incremental adjustments to the way that you're doing things with checkpoints after each one. And if you're executing in that incremental way, then there's very little risk because you're only risking one small piece of the investment at a time, and you can keep adjusting as you see how things are going. So what I found that works often is, yes, think about your multi-year, big picture for transformation. Make sure there's a vision, make sure everybody understands where it's going, but at the same time, execute incrementally and small in such a way that you're always accomplishing in the direction of your overall vision. The second problem that I mentioned is the perceived deficit in skills and culture. If you step back for a second, I think you'll see that, of course, there is a deficit in skills and culture. Every organization that's planning to transform necessarily has that kind of a deficit. They don't have the skills for the future world that they're envisioning because they have the skills for the present world. They have developed their own culture based on the way they've done things in the past. Employees have the skills that have been demanded of them in the past. And when they look towards the future, of course, they're going to think, well, that's not what we need. The trick here, I think, is to think of new skills and new culture as an output of the transformation process rather than as a prerequisite for it. As you transform, you're going to change the way you do things, and people are going to acquire new skills. They're going to find new ways to be successful. And as they find those new ways to be successful, the culture will gel around those new ways of success. Culture essentially is a way of enforcing patterns of success or developing a shared understanding of what leads to success. So the cultural change and the new skills tend to come along with the transformation as you're changing things. The perceived lack of time and capacity. Well, it's typical for companies to already be using every bit of capacity that they have. Lean theory perhaps tells us that that's a bad idea. Full capacity utilization means that you can't adjust and you can't shorten your lead time for each thing you do, but it's normal in a company to have everybody occupied all the time. And if you ever found that some of your people were not busy and, prepared to work on new initiatives like a transformation, you probably would have fired them already because you're expecting full productivity. So any organization that's starting on the transformation path has to be figuring out ways to carve out the time and carve out parts of the capacity. Well, the trick to doing it, I found, is to understand the priority for the transformation. If the transformation is not a high priority, don't do it. It's going to take a lot of effort. But usually, as I said with the nodding heads before, people will realize that it's imperative to transform. What you have to do is find the way to translate that sense of need and priority into actual day-to-day priorities. What often works on this front is for the IT organization to take a proactive stance when it comes to figuring out the organization's priorities, rather than passively waiting for requests, backlog items from different parts of the business. If the IT organization is driving priorities, it can take into consideration the overall priority for transformation, its strategic nature, the things that the company is trying to accomplish by transforming, and balance it against the other requests that it's getting that are maybe less important and more incidental to the operation of the business. Next is what I call the real lack of alignment. And it's related to my previous point. I said that what you really need to do is figure out what the purpose of the transformation is and use that as a way to drive urgency. And often when I'm talking to organizations that are in the middle of a transformation, I find that they haven't drawn that line between what's important to the company as a whole and the digital transformation itself. So, for example, um, let's say you're thinking about the business case for your transformation or the business case for moving to the cloud or something like that. It's tempting to think of it just in terms of the IT mechanics of it. Are you going to save money on the instances that you're spinning up in the cloud? Are you going to find faster ways to develop software, whatever it is? That's often the focus when organizations first think about the business case. But really, if the reason why you're moving to the cloud is because you need to find ways to prevent fraud in payments to your company, then the value, the point of your business case, the value of the cloud is how much you reduce fraud. If you're trying to streamline operations, take costs out of the company's processes, well, then the business case is based on what you're going to save by taking those costs out of the processes, out of the business processes. If your priority is to be prepared for the next pandemic or something like that, success and the basis for the business case is about that. It's about the value of being prepared for the next pandemic. So often what we need to do is translate those business priorities that are the reason why we're doing the transformation into the guiding principle of the transformation. We need to translate it into the actions we're going to take that we can directly connect back to those results that we're hoping to get. That's the key to getting that urgency behind the transformation. It's also the key to scoping what's going to be in this transformation, because you can then focus on the things that are going to directly contribute to that business result. Which leads me to the last point, The fact that transformation is so important to people, so important to everyone in the company, that paradoxically it's hard to move forward because everybody has their pet projects, their pet ideas, the goals that they're hoping the transformation will accomplish. At US Citizenship and Immigration Services in the Department of Homeland Security, when I was CIO, we started our transformation initiative by gathering requirements from all around the organization, and the result was two huge binders of requirements that it wasn't even done. You know, they were getting thicker and thicker. We wound up locking most of the executives of the agency into a room for an entire week to review all those requirements to make sure that we had captured everything. Well, if you proceed along that path, it's going to take you a very long time to make sure you've got everything and you've documented it and analyzed it and thought about it. The tactic, I think, for escaping from this is, again, to think incrementally, but also to be very clear on what the high-level strategic purpose of the transformation is, and begin with a scope that's just related to that high-level purpose. The hard part here is excluding things that you really would like to see, but with the trust that if you start executing quickly and incrementally, you are going to be able to accomplish all of those things. It's just that if you try too hard to enumerate them all in advance, you're probably never going to get to the point where you actually start accomplishing them. So with that as background, I've covered what I think are usually the sticking points that slow people down. And so now let me sort of propose what it looks like if you actually were able to move forward, and how I would suggest that you start and get that traction that you're looking for. And so the first thing, I did work for Homeland Security, so I think a lot about security. And to me, that's where you start. You start by defining a security posture for your transformed environment and agreeing on what that's going to look like. Now, the temptation, of course, is to spend too much time to try to get a perfect security posture before you start doing anything. And that, as we know, will never happen because security is never perfect. You always keep improving your security posture. Bad guys keep thinking of new ways to defeat your security. You have to keep improvising new changes to the way you're protecting yourself. So you'll never get perfection. I always start with the idea that you want to be at least as good as you are today. So what is it going to take for you to set up your new cloud environment, your new software delivery practices, the other things that you're doing? What's it going to take to make them at least as secure as what you have today? And then later you can incrementally keep improving those things. So that's where I start. And to me, that's the only prerequisite for getting moving with the transformation. The second thing to do is to select a small number of business goals that are going to be the driving goals for your transformation. And those might be what we've always thought of as business goals. The examples I gave before, reducing fraud, for example, taking costs out of your operations. But today, a lot of things that we thought of as technology goals before are really business goals as well. For example, the availability of your IT systems. Well, that's actually a business goal, making them more available because your business is probably losing money when your IT systems are not available. It's a direct driver of your revenues. That's just one example, but then there are a few things that are a little bit harder to value or to talk about for most companies, and those are things like agility and resilience. They're sort of on that borderline between technology goals and goals of the rest of the business. Agility has value. Agility, the way I define it, is the ability when things change around you to move quickly, to move at low cost and at low risk to address those changes. And that's very much a business goal. And if you can get there, if you can be agile, then it has value to you as an organization, but sometimes it's a little hard to formulate the precise business case for becoming more agile. Or resilience. Are you going to be prepared to respond to a pandemic like COVID or some other major disruption? Well, each of these things is sort of unlikely, but collectively, the chance that something major is going to happen that you're going to need to be resilient to is pretty high. So choose a small set of goals that are the goals that you see a business justification for, that you're going to use to drive the first part of your transformation. And then typically I like to dashboard those things. Let's actually measure, if we can, how much we've reduced those operational costs, or how much fraud we've protected, or how much we've increased availability. Let's just make a dashboard right out of the gate. Sometimes I call this BI driven development, as in business intelligence driven development or analytics driven development. First, let's make the tool that's going to measure our success, and then we'll start working towards that goal. Next thing we do is create teams that are cross-functional teams that are empowered and autonomous, because here we're in a situation where we want to create that forward motion, and so we want people accountable for getting the forward motion. And that should be their entire focus. That should be what's on their minds all the time, is how are we going to move forward with the transformation? Everybody else in the organization has other things on their minds and has other things to think about. It's hard to move forward unless you have a group that is autonomous and highly focused on driving things forward. And then the last thing that I would say before actually starting is to be careful about changing incentives for people. This gets in the way of a lot of transformations that I see, where people are still operating against the old models of success. They're operating against the incentives that you've set for them in the past. And if they're doing that, then they're probably not moving forward aggressively on the transformation. What leadership needs to do is reset the definition of success for people to be in line with the transformed state, or at least partway there. This might include financial incentives, or might just include how people think about what their role is, and what they're being asked for and asked to report on consistently. So with those things in place, you're ready to charge ahead. And this is the time when you start moving forward incrementally. I've deliberately phrased everything that I've set up till now as something that can be incrementally improved. So yes, you want to have a great security posture, but the way to get there is you start transforming, you start building new things, you start moving to the cloud or moving to DevOps or whatever else your transformation consists of. And you start delivering value incrementally, delivering results, including on your new security posture, which is better than your old one, but not perfect. You are incrementally developing skills, as I said before. You're incrementally refining your technical architecture, and you are managing your costs. You're setting a baseline for what things are going to cost you in the cloud or with DevOps in the future. And you're going to, in small increments, you're going to improve on all of these things. You're going to be delivering against that dashboard that you set up before. You're going to be changing the culture of your organization. And to make the transformation move, instead of thinking of it as one big deliverable that's many years out, you're thinking of it more as something that you can do tomorrow or in the next 2 weeks. And then after the next 2 weeks, you think again, what are you going to do in the next 2 weeks? I'm not saying you don't move with a plan, but the plan is a long-term forward-thinking way of scoping what you're doing. At the same time, you're always asking yourself, what can we do right now that moves us towards that state? And you're doing it through an empowered, autonomous team that's 100% focused on this. and you can see results frequently. Let's say every day, every week. I said with USCIS, it was 3 times a day we were able to do. But you can see them as actual business results because you are releasing transformed capabilities constantly as you move forward. So to sum it all up, I think this is actually easier than most people think when it comes to transformation. The way that you get traction on your transformation and the way that you get momentum and move towards your goals is simply by starting today. You set up the environment that you need in a fast way that's very focused on being able to start delivering, and then you start delivering and you start changing. And you do it in a conscious way so that at the same time as you're achieving results, you're also transforming your culture, you're transforming the skills that people have, you're refining your architectures and security posture and everything else. And you're doing it producing results constantly, starting immediately. So transform today, not tomorrow, literally. Thank you all very much for listening. Good luck with your digital transformations. If you do have a chance to complete the session survey, we would really appreciate it. Thanks again.